The equalizer helps you understand the cause and effect. Psychological operations warfare capture their minds and their hearts and souls will follow. Psychological operations or PSYOP are planned operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of organizations, groups, and individuals. Used in all aspects of war, it is a weapon whose effectiveness is limited only by the ingenuity of the commander using it. A proven winner in combat and peacetime, PSYOP is one of the oldest weapons in the arsenal of man. It is an important force protector, combat multiplier, and a non-lethal weapon system. Psychological operations PSYOP or psychological warfare. PSYWAR is simply learning everything about your target enemy, their beliefs, likes, dislikes, strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Once you know what motivates your target, you are ready to begin psychological operations. Psychological operations may be defined broadly as the planned use of communications to influence human attitudes and behavior to create in target groups behavior, emotions, and attitudes that support the attainment of national objectives. The form of communication can be as simple as spreading information covertly by word of mouth or through any means of multimedia. A psychological warfare campaign is a war of the mind. Your primary weapons are sight and sound. PSYOP can be disseminated by face-to-face communication, audio-visual means, television, audio media, radio or loudspeaker, visual media, leaflets, newspapers, books, magazines and/or posters. The weapon is not how it's said, but the message it carries and how that message affects the recipient. For instance, our American flag, when it goes by in a parade, do you feel a sense of pride? How about when you hear our national anthem played? How about God Bless the USA, Lee Greenwood's song which became popular during Desert Storm? Music or sound can be a major factor in motivating emotion if it is associated with the right message. How many of you think about the pottery wheel scene with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore in the movie Ghost when you hear the theme song Unchained Melody? It has long been said that the pen is mightier than the sword. That is because, if used properly, words can be an inspiration to motivate others. Some examples: remember the Alamo, give me liberty or give me death, I regret I have but one life to give for my country. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country now. For psychological operations to be effective, you must carefully plan your propaganda. You must make sure that you know everything about your enemy and that you are targeting his beliefs and not using your own. For example, at the very beginning of Desert Shield, just after Iraq invaded Kuwait, President Bush referred to Saddam Hussein as being just like Adolf Hitler. For Americans and most of Europe, that was an insulting comparison. However, looking at it through the eyes of an Iraqi soldier, Adolf Hitler tried to exterminate all the Jews. Iraq has long hated Israel. Hitler drove out the British and French forces that had long occupied the Middle East. So with the right propaganda, the comparison could be interpreted that Saddam, like Hitler, hates Israel and wants to keep the Western infidel influence from contaminating the Middle East. This would be a compliment, not an insult. On the reverse side, knowing your enemy's beliefs can work for you. For example, remember when Saddam Hussein broadcasted live images of his human shields, the women and children of Westerners that were in Iraq when the war broke out? The Quran, the Muslim Bible, states that you can do what you with your enemy, but that you must not harm his family, wife and children. Saddam's actions allowed us to show that he was a coward, hiding behind innocent people and ignoring the Muslim laws he was so quick to say he was defending. How do you get to know your enemy? Intelligence reports, area studies, in-country research, defectors, native help, and even the enemy prisoners of war all are sources of information. As leaflets were developed during Desert Storm, they were tested on cooperative EPWs, enemy prisoners of war. Some of the recommendations for changes to the leaflets' illustrations made by these EPWs were: remove any trace of the color red, a danger signal to Iraqis, show allied soldiers with chin beards rather than clean-shaven faces. Beards convey trust and brotherhood in Iraqi culture, and add bananas to a bowl of fruit shown being offered to surrendering Iraqis. Bananas are a great delicacy in Iraq. Also, An illustration depicting a surrendering Iraqi thinking of his family back home confused the EPWs. Thought bubbles are well known in Western culture, but virtually unknown to Iraqis. The illustration was dropped. In a memo written to then Secretary of State John Foster Dulles on October 24, 1953, former U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower defined psychological warfare as anything from the singing of a beautiful anthem up to the most extraordinary kind of physical sabotage. Used during peacetime, contingencies and declared war, these activities are not a form of force, but are force multipliers that use nonviolent means in often violent environments. Persuading rather than compelling physically, they rely on logic, fear, desire or other mental factors to promote specific emotions, attitudes or behaviors. The ultimate objective of U.S. military psychological operations is the dissemination of truthful information to foreign audiences in support of U.S. policy and national objectives to convince enemy, neutral, and friendly nations and forces to take action favorable to the United States and its allies. Now please note that I stated above that psychological operations as conducted by the U.S. military is the dissemination of truthful information, not propaganda which is categorized as white, gray, or black. Now what is the difference between PSYOP and propaganda? A memorandum prepared by the Chief of Army Field Forces at Fort Monroe, Virginia in September of 1953 briefly explained the difference between gray propaganda, messages broadcast with the goal of avoiding identification, and black propaganda, which involves attribution to a source other than the true one. A more recent set of definitions, reportedly used by former CIA Chief William Colby and cited in at least one commercial publication, calls truthfully attributed and non-attributed messages white propaganda, whereas messages falsely attributed to a third party are considered gray. The term black propaganda is reserved for those materials planted by the United States but in such a way that it seems to be the product or even an internal document of the target group. In other words, black propaganda is nothing less than a form of intellectual and political subversion,